Great. Hi, everyone. My name's Renee Reisman. I'm currently the creative catalyst and artist in residence at the Los Angeles Department of Transportation. But what I'm presenting here was actually the remnants of my thesis research for an MFA I just completed in June. Yes, MFA is Master of Fine Art, but I did my thesis on infrastructure, so you know. So it was called Spectacular Grammar, Infrastructure as a Universal Language. I'm realizing we're going to probably touch on some of the same themes that came up in the last talk with utopianism and the ideal, and so it won't be like a repeat, but I think it's kind of cool that I'm thematically following up. So this idea of universal language has kind of always been in society. We have the Tower of Babel, which is like the biblical story, the legend, or I guess if you believe, not a legend, whatever. The story is that everybody spoke the same language, and then they tried to do this big tower to reach God, and God's like, no, you can't reach me, and then cast his energy and made it so everybody fell off the tower, and wherever they landed, they spoke a new language. And that's why we have like hundreds and thousands of languages in the world, and we don't all speak the same way. Universal language is also more of a modern attempt too. Like, just because it didn't happen in biblical times, people have always been trying to do it. So L.L. Zamenhof is the guy who invented Esperanto in the, I think it was the late 19th century. And so this is the most common auxiliary language, which is like a second language that is invented, and it's the most common universal language right now that exists in the world. There's an estimate up to 2 million people speak Esperanto. It is based in Romance languages. It sounds a lot like Italian a little bit, and it's supposed to be super easy for anyone to learn because it doesn't have complicated conjugations. I think it only has a few tenses. But if you're not like a speaker of a romantic language, let's say your Mandarin is your first language, Esperanto is actually not going to be that easy for you to learn because you're not used to that alphabet and you're not used to those characters. So it's universal, but maybe not the easiest and maybe a little Eurocentric. So we also had this idea of universal language even further. This is the 18th century with Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, which I might be mispronouncing. But he invented this idea of the characteristica universalis. And so universal character. Now, unlike a universal language with like the structure of language and grammar and rules to acknowledge, the universal character is actually more of a symbol standing in for a thought. Now, he was working in mathematics, and so if we think of algebra, that might be the easiest way to think of a universal character, where whenever you make a formula, x equals a value, and so x is your universal character. But it's very malleable, and it can change depending on your context. So this idea of a symbol equals an idea, rather than like words and meanings is ideas, that's called an asematic or asemic language, which means that you're not basing it on like sentence structures, but you have symbols that just mean ideas, and so there's no semantic, like there's no oral semantic meanings. And part of why he came up with this is because the universal character is necessary for global trade. So with our last speaker talking about globalization, that was kind of the biggest driver of a universal character and a universal language in this era. Like I said, he's late 18th century, Esperanto is late 19th century, so this is when we're starting to get to the industrialization, globalization, industrial revolution, and suddenly exporting, importing products and needing to talk the same way got really, really important. So I wanted to kind of break this speech down into two different ideas that we'll link together. As an art historian, I think that the characteristica universalis is something that was explored once again with the avant-garde cinema. So here we go, one more time. We have filmmakers in the 1920s, Viking Egeling and Hans Richter, working together on the Universalsprache, or universal speech. They were German filmmakers. Actually, Egeling was Dutch, but they worked in German together. And they also were like, okay, if we could have symbols mean ideas, like, we're going to create a language through film, through avant-garde film, that everyone will speak. So I just wanted to play a little, see if this works. So I'm just going to play a little bit of this. And I want, oh, it looks like I can't skim through it. Well, we'll just have to wait a few minutes for it to get past the credits. But this is talking about the experiment of the universal language. This one's Viking Egeling's Symphony Diagonale from 1924. Blah, blah, blah. Okay, so we can see these images. There's also music, but however, the music's not really that important. When these were originally shown, there was no music because it was the silent film era, so whoever was playing piano in real life was making up the soundtrack. But now that this is playing and we have these symbols, can people like raise their hands and have a little discussion? Like, what does this read to you? Like, what is something that you think of when you're watching this? Anybody? One or... Yeah. I'm sorry. Driving through a city? Okay. For me, all the lines evoke like classical music or actually, honestly, like I have this like grid pattern in my dress somewhere, so I'm thinking fashion and fabric too. Any other ideas? Anything else that this evokes? Oh yeah, music boxes. Yeah, oh yeah, when you open a music box and it looks like a little piano thing, isn't it? Yeah. Okay. Okay. Art looks like art. Yeah, this is actually right out of the abstract expressionism era, so it has a direct reference to it. So what do you think? So part of why I wanted to get people's ideas on what you think is because there was no universal consensus on what that video mean, right? So how is that working as a universal language? It's not. And so that's the very problem with this idea of making universal language, is that how do you do it? Because the character doesn't mean anything. There's no consensus, right? So now let's take this idea of the universal character and apply it to our infrastructure, things that we're used to. So here are some examples of universal characters in infrastructure. We have the Wi-Fi symbol, the globe symbol, the location, the power button, the @ for the email, the hamburger. I'm actually not even sure if the hamburger is super common in other cultures, but you know, these are all our universal characters, right? We can use these around the world and we should be able to know what they mean. And these are all internet infrastructure. So we have something starting to emerge with the universal character. It's much more effective than the avant-garde films that like didn't really mean anything to anyone, but these have been like implemented enough that we really are like, okay, I can go to Japan, I can see a Wi-Fi symbol, and me and everyone in Japan knows what it means, supposedly. And that's because they've become internationally standardized, standardized, which is a process that is global, where we take infrastructure, systems, even quality control checks, and we have organizations make ways that everybody needs to do it. So the shipping container is the best example of the international standardization. The shipping container, going back to commerce, was like, how do we do a globalized trade system with all our docks and all our ports? Well, we need a box that everything can fit into and every port can use. Before that, we had no systemized cargo. So you have shapes, like cargo of all shapes, different ways of roping it, different ways of sliding it off the docks. And so, and even like up until modern times, we're still shipping things in very awkward containers that are not interchangeable. So in the 1950s, I think he was from North Carolina, but an American engineer was like, I need to fix this like problem. And so we have these now, which everybody once again knows. So who is standardizing these containers? Well, we have 3 organizations that are our main people. They're all in Switzerland. We have the International Organization for Standardization, the International Telecommunications Union, and the International Electrotechnical Commission, the EIC. What do they do? Basically everything. Food safety, hardware, information security procedures, even our date and time methods are internationally standard, even our languages and our car seats, railway fuels, even the type of data encoded on the web has to be standardized so we can talk to each other. So part of what's interesting, though, is that international standardization has a very, very, very disproportional influence from the United States, and China is also trying to catch up right now with influencing how standards are set. And Europe has been there for the longest time, but it's really like the US and China right now that are like, who's going to standardize technology? And I think this is really important because when we go back to thinking of the universal character or things like Esperanto, when we say, oh, everyone can speak it, we have to think, well, who is inventing the language? If America is setting our international standards, we're going to be speaking the way that Silicon Valley or the United States wants us to speak. If China is setting it, we're going to be speaking in a way that kind of upholds all of their ideology and economic systems. So part of why, so I guess in conclusion, we are developing a universal language via infrastructure and international standardization, but we really, really need to pay attention to who is setting it and what it implies if certain perspectives have a disproportionate influence on how we speak. So I wanted just to get to more of a discussion, and now that we kind of have all this background set up, I wanted the rest of the talk to be like, how do we reclaim a universal language of infrastructure that might not actually be universal? What are some ways that we can give power to people that have nothing to do with designing international standards and have to use the technologies that are kind of given to us? The other issue is that international standardization set by these small consortiums in the United States or in Europe or in China, like everyday people, like none of us are sitting in on these meetings and being like, hey, maybe we should take these perspectives into account. So I think we'll probably have a lot more conversation about it later during this conference, but some people have peer-to-peer sharing as one way to like reclaim this language where there's no intermediary servers anymore. You're just talking directly to each other. I think there's going to be a DOT workshop at some point. Yeah, so that's kind of the bulk of the background. So I didn't know if we wanted to talk about this or do the thing where you talk to each other first and then we participate. But we have like about 15 minutes, so I wanted the other half of this to be about that.